Good morning, everybody. We're going to get started. So I'm Annie Donovan, and I'm the incoming CEO of CoopMetics. And I'm going to be your moderator for today. And before we get started, I just want to thank the Heron Foundation, Clara and Dana and Buzz and everybody else for putting together this fantastically stimulating meeting on this important subject. It's really the cutting edge where we need to go to move forward in the social space and just holds so much promise, and I'm really, really excited about it. So thank you for including me and CoopMetics in this adventure. And I also just want to thank Mauricio Lim Miller for your comments last night and for reminding us why we're all here. Sometimes we get into such intellectual conversations and we're so in our intellectual brain that we forget the heart space from which a lot of us are motivated and for which the true purpose of our work is. So thank you for that reminder and for all your fantastic results. So we're going to get started, and as Dana said, this is enterprise. We're going to take a enterprise view. And Dana hinted at this, and when she said, we don't think we actually have any enterprise level data, so I don't know what we're going to talk about, guys. The enterprise level, the data at the enterprise level is a big mystery that we need to solve. And so we're going to delve into it to the extent that we know we're really looking for what's the state of play here. And this is a fantastic panel because they are all themselves entrepreneurs, founders and CEOs. And they have been working either at the edges or in the heart of this matter. And so we're going to hear from them. And so we're going to start off the panel with Elizabeth Dreicer. Elizabeth is, I'm sorry, I said it wrong, Dreicer, sorry. She's the CEO of Kuity. And what we're going to do in this panel is I'll introduce each of the panelists one by one, and they'll start with the probing into the question of why. Why did you start your company, and what are you trying to accomplish? So, Elizabeth.
Happy to. I'll just briefly touch on why I started Kuity, and then I'll dig into why we started serving the social sector in the last almost 2 years, I guess, that we've been thinking about this sector. By way of background, though, I think this is sort of pertinent. I've been thinking about how to improve society for the better part of 20 years, sort of directly out of college, what my inspiration was, and Mauricio touched on it. I have a schizophrenic brother who ended up in foster care early in life, and it had a profound impact on my family. And so I felt compelled early in my career to start giving back, and I started to participate in nonprofit boards. And then eventually ended up on a foundation board 12 years ago, now almost 13 years ago. And for much of that time, I chaired an investment committee on that board. So I just share that as by way of background before I get into sort of my professional life. I've been leading analytic science-oriented companies for about 15 years. Prior to starting Kuity, which we started about 7 years ago, I worked on a project relating to medicine. How do we encode medicine and know what's wrong with us more regularly? It's a reducible problem using analytic science, and I think that we are just on the tip today of what's possible. People have been looking at this for many, many years. We sold that company to Healthways, a disease management company, and I sort of was sitting around thinking about what do I really care about, and I think decision science and sort of how we make decisions in the world can greatly improve. And Kuity started with the idea that there's this huge raft of enterprise data, and that data are largely inaccessible to the people who need to utilize it. And if you think about it, we have no idea. There's so many sort of political aspects of what gets decided. It's not optimized. And so, sort of the inspiration I had was, we have a flight simulator system in gaming, and yet we don't have anything even close to that in the enterprise world. And so the whole idea was to build dynamic enterprise simulation. That's what Kuity started on, and we built a practice in financial services, defense, cybersecurity. And about 2 years ago, on one of the boards that I'm on, Kathleen Mead, the Chief Operating Officer of the California Endowment, challenged me and said, "Hey, Elizabeth, you're working on all this great stuff over here, and P.S. we're really struggling in this space." And so what Heron is saying is I think true for a lot of folks. So what can we do here? And in that context, I started to think about it, and we have been contemplating if we had to reimagine, blank slate, what would we develop for the sector? And what we've been working on is going to be unveiled as POSIBA for possible. We've been working on an enterprise platform that can, we think, transform enterprise level intelligence for the foundation world and nonprofit world. And we can talk more about that. But that my inspiration, I guess, sort of on a very simple level, is I've been making a lot of bad decisions for a long time in my philanthropic work. We have scant data. It's a lot of gut reaction, what gets presented. Who knows if that was the best thing or not. During a stint I had, I've invested in things like baby doll therapy to try to reduce teen pregnancy, and I know it doesn't work. I know it's laughable now. It just didn't seem so obvious to us at the time, and so it's a personal desire. I'd like to do more of the good stuff, do less of the bad stuff, and kind of know the difference. Sorry, just being honest. Sorry.
I think we can find common cause in that, Elizabeth. So let's move on to Tim Ferguson. Tim is the founder and CEO of NextStreet. And Tim, why don't you tell us a little bit about NextStreet and what you're trying to accomplish?
So NextStreet was formed about 8 years ago with a specific attempt to try and fill a gap for smaller businesses initially, but it's also extended to include nonprofits. To provide them with what we call world-class advisory services and access to capital. And these entities are all based or serve the inner city communities that we work within. So for the most part, we're in what I think obviously a cellar corridor with offices in Boston and New York and about 50 professionals covering a variety of different competencies and skills.
Great. And next up we have Richard Ling, and Richard is the founder and partner at Rembrandt Venture Partners, in addition to several other ventures that you've created. So why don't you tell us a little bit about your path?
Sure. So years ago I started several startups, starting in 1995, focused on ad targeting, email search company, companies of that ilk. And then in 2004, started a venture fund. So I'd been doing that for about 8 years, sort of essentially joined the dark side, even though they did fund most of these companies, and these all sold to big, large public corporations. And about a year and a half ago, ended up helping to start a company called Impact, which was to essentially help to try to change up the way that nonprofits are able to go and acquire and engage their user base, donor base, volunteer base, whatever constituency groups they're trying to reach. But utilizing a lot of the techniques that I had learned were very, very effective in ad targeting, in sort of consumer user, funnel conversions into getting somebody to buy something, right? So one of the things we did at Impulse Buy, which is even way back in the 1996 timeframe, was we would essentially, drop federated cookies across 800 different websites, and tracking by crawling the context of these pages, understanding what the pages were about. So you were reading an article about golfing, or you went to Golf Digest or golfing.com, we would infer that you were a golfer and therefore show you golf ads as opposed to tampon ads or something, right? And so you would probably get just as an example, and but you would get probably 3 to 5x the click-through rate. Even back in those days, right? And click-through rates were horrible then, and they're even worse now. But that level of targeting, even that rudimentary type of targeting was sort of working. And then we would do all sorts of testing on these websites to convert people into making an actual purchase, if you will. And we would find out you could literally change 2 words on some of this copy, and you would get like 37% higher click-through rates, but only on a Wednesday to Friday afternoon, and only for certain age groups, demographic age groups of people, right? But you are trying to really start to capture a lot of data and infer at that level the demographic, psychographic information of people. And it absolutely does help to get people more activated, and tremendous amounts of effort has been put into these kind of technologies over the last 15 years. And it is quite a competitive arena out there for most retailers, and and even mainstream brand advertising has started to adopt a lot of these things, right? And so our thought was, hey, why don't we do this, except instead of the call to action, getting people to buy more golf clubs or handbags, get them to be much more active and participate in nonprofits or the causes that they care about. But deployed in a way that makes it so easy for them to do. Because one of the other things we learned is that most of these, even the larger nonprofit enterprises, have very limited technical resources, and they really don't know how to do these things themselves. So what we did was we actually called ourselves back then a shopping affiliate network, which is now quite a fairly common practice amongst most major e-commerce companies. Right? Amazon has their own. There's a company called Ling, there's one called Commission Junction, and they do this for now thousands of online retailers, even the very large ones, right? Macy's.com, Target, they all use Ling and other sort of outsourced capability services like that, right? So what we found is the nonprofits don't know what they're doing in terms of having the resources to understand and to utilize some of these tools. And the problem is you can't even just buy these tools as a nonprofit, because the ontologies that are mapped are all about shopping. It's all about identifying somebody as a golfer, and they will buy a high-end purse. Whereas the calls to actions for nonprofits are, hey, it's about getting somebody to donate money. And some people will donate smaller amounts because that's what they're capable of, and some would donate larger amounts. And oh, by the way, others may not be able to donate much, but they're willing to volunteer large amounts of time, right? And so what we want to do is start having these nonprofits drop their cookies so that, one, we can understand people's activity across the entire website. We also want to start to track social media interactions, because we think this is the one arena where people are willing to start to outreach to their friends, right? One of the things with shopping is there have been a lot of startups I've looked at that were trying to sort of bring the sort of social media shopping into play, right? Tell your friends that you bought this handbag and we'll give you 5% for every handbag they buy. A lot of people aren't really wanting to pimp up handbags to their friends to make $5 on Facebook. Hey, everybody buy this handbag, right? What we are, what I think most people's experiences are is that, hey, if your brother-in-law asks you, hey, will you share this, video about a human rights issue and put it on Facebook or tell your friends about it, you are much more likely to do that than, somebody asking you to share a product you bought, right? And so if that's the case, though, the problem is it's a missed opportunity in terms of understanding what happens once that gets shared, right? So one of the things what we're doing is we are tracking the, we create a unique URL for, so when you share that video, for example, about a human rights issue, and you ask your friends, hey, this is a really important issue, please either, watch this little, 3-minute video clip, we actually can then track, because it's a persistent, unique URL tied to that video and tied to that individual person. And so Elizabeth would share it out, and we can actually now, later on, tell that nonprofit, did you know in 3 weeks, Elizabeth got 27 people to come back to your website? Oh, by the way. And Facebook doesn't even know that, because they lose you once you leave on, right? And oh, by the way, because we're tracking everything across this website, and it's actually deployed, I should state that, as it's basically copying and pasting JavaScript on a website. So from the point of view of the nonprofit, they really don't have to do much, right? They're not doing all this analytics on the back end. It's very similar to the way Amazon does their affiliate program, where fashion bloggers can copy and paste JavaScript, and they all know how. They have 1 million affiliate partners, right? But back to the what we do is once you track that, you can now start to understand what these users who come back, who actually was able to get 27 people back versus 3, right? And oh, by the way, of those 27 people, 4 of them actually donated money, and they donated in total $125. And oh, by the way, that nonprofit didn't even know that you got 4 people to donate $125, because they would have gone back and they probably didn't even tell you, right? Nobody's calling you, hey, Elizabeth, I guess what, I donated $20 to this cause I saw on your Facebook post, right? And so now all of a sudden you can start to identify champions for the nonprofits, and then our goal is to actually give them a really simple way where they click a button, and again, all these things involve clicking buttons, right? And send an automatic message to Elizabeth that says, Elizabeth, thank you so much. Did you know 3 weeks ago you got 27 people to come back to our website and watch this video about this issue, and you also got us $125. And so start giving that feedback and making this type of activity much more transparent and visible. not even just to the nonprofit, but to the participants, the users themselves, right? We think that can engender a much stronger sense of, sort of contribution, if you will. And so hence the name of the company's impact. Our goal is to say, hey, everybody in the world times millions of people doing it can make, create massive impact, right? Except today, it's not transparent. Nobody knows what's going on. It's completely lost. And this is a way to capture data that we think can ultimately be, much more effectively used to now understand what people care about, who actually gets more people to volunteer, who actually has more time, who actually, is more influential, who actually gets more money donated, right? And really change up that whole conversation so that you're not, relying upon, just, sources of grants from organizations like Clara's and et cetera. But now you can, and what you're also doing is, creating that ability to have a much greater, audience out there, right? Okay. That understands your mission. Sorry for the length of the talk.
So the first question I want to ask you is, all three of you have experience in the for-profit space, and you've ventured into the nonprofit space. So tell us a little bit about what you see. What's your diagnosis in terms of the nonprofit space and what's needed?
Well, I think we have to distinguish the funders from the grantees and the people who are actually operators. And in some places, I know in Europe, for example, most of the foundations, or a lot of them, are operating foundations. So I'm really speaking to the U.S. audience. On the funder side, I think there's no burning need. Even though there's a lot of talk, and I think that there's a lot of good intent, I think that nobody's earnings, nobody's worried about posting earnings, nobody's worried about sort of the business sort of pace. And so as a result, I think that the process is slow. On the grantee side, or the fund seeker side, I think that they're very hungry for ways to produce intel that will generate awareness among funders and donors both, that they are a good operation and that they are creating value. And I think that they have a real challenge telling their story, because they don't think in terms that the finance folks or even people who think about impact think about. And I'll make this concrete. So during my stint on the 211 San Diego Board of Directors, I don't know if you guys know what 211 is, but it's sort of like a social service line in terms of gathering the thousands of different service providers in a region. It's sort of mimicked off of, instead of 911 being emergency services, 211 is really around providing intel around, if I need services for an Alzheimer's parent, or if I need, if I have trouble, getting health insurance, you can call this, and they've got, the thousands of agencies. Well, what's interesting is that they had no way of really thinking about what in our business world we think about as, balanced scorecard, or sort of how are we moving? We can think about profit. Well, in their case, what's the value you're unlocking? And I almost feel like it's just a language that's not present. So I actually, during my tenure, helped them get somebody who was Six Sigma, black belt, come in, really put them through the discipline of balanced scorecard, and we really were able to suss out our value and really change a lot of the operations. But it took that sort of business thinking coming in to look at that. Annie, getting back to the point, I guess they're hungry, less resourced, not necessarily able to put the money necessary to have the sort of high-priced, expensive talent that does this important work. And so you have, the funders who have capability to fund. You have nonprofits that I think want, my assessment largely is I'm optimistic that both sides actually want it. It's just a matter of, sort of figuring out how to play the match. But it's that's. So
there's not a there's no compeller in there. There's nobody saying,
right,
we have to have that, or.
Yeah, we're not trying to hit our quarterly numbers. If you walk in and, somebody, I think the analogy, I think Amanda works with Cisco. If I got a call from many of the corporate clients that we work with, usually the calls are, we're in trouble, we need this right now, And in a matter of literally a couple of days, it's deployed and going. You've got a team, you're working it. I don't think we have that kind of time paradigm in the funder community.
Tim, what's your...
So I kind of want to draw on two things. So one is what worked in the world that I was in before, and then bring it specific to Next Street, some of the things that we've seen. I think that there's been a lot of discussion about what the foundations, the funders, and the nonprofits do or don't have. So I'm not going to repeat that because I don't think that it's going to necessarily move the conversation forward. I mean, I think one of the single most important things is terminology. The lexicon is not at all clear, whether it's standards or whatever else it happens to be. And when I look back on my own past, it's when we agreed collectively to create standards for the industry that it began to actually change the way that we operated with regard to the collection of data and then its utilization. And the transparency was really, really important. As Clara said yesterday, how we incent, or the word compel was used, that's not, Wall Street people understand incent, they don't understand compel. Everyone to fall into line is really, really important, and probably from the funder's perspective, it is actually about the funding. The single biggest tool that you wield at the end of the day is the funds that you control as an institution, as an organization. And I actually don't feel that funders use that as effectively as they could do to build the infrastructure components of the market that you're operating. In my experience, transparency will create private markets. Right? And one of the goals, as we've heard consistently over the last 2 days, is not just to have philanthropy flow into these markets, but also to leverage that many times to have the private capital as well flowing into the marketplace as well. And if we don't have transparency and we don't have information and data, it will not happen. Or it'll happen, but it'll be in dribbles. It won't be in a flood and something that becomes serious. Investors and others, if they have the information, they'll see opportunity, and it will bring other participants. And that has good points to it, and it has bad points to it. But other people will come into the market space. So what Mauricio was talking about last night, as he begins to prove that, he has data to show it, it's really hard for people to say, well, show me, right? Which is so often the response of someone who's thinking about changing a paradigm or funding something that's trying to do that. In the investment world, to make it specific to direct experience that I've had, on the research side, one of the problems was that all of the big Wall Street investment banks provided research to us in very many different formats. And they also provided it in print copy. So you could walk around the investment floors and you would see piles and piles of research papers. And what we did is that we basically got a group together of the big so-called buy-side firms, so the big fund managers who control the flow of money through the Wall Street houses at that point in time. This is before the rise of the hedge funds. And we agreed that what we wanted was to create a set of common standards that meant that they were being asked to chart all of their analytical work with a particular set of terminology, standards, whatever you want to call it, that would then allow us to mix and match as analysts if that's what we wanted to do. So we could take the revenue analysis from Morgan Stanley and couple it with a cost analysis of Goldman Sachs, or whatever it happened to be. So it just made it far, far more efficient, and it made the models fungible. The buy side, we had a common interest. We wanted to do that. We needed to do it. So we didn't care about the fact that we were all going to have fundamentally the same base model that we were asking them to work from. And it happened. And from Wall Street's point of view, they had an economic interest. We controlled, with Morgan, Merrill, and Goldman, $100 million each of revenues that were flowing to them over the course of a 12-month period. Fidelity, 3 or 4 times that, Wellington, et cetera. So they had an interest to do it. I want to share a failure with you, because failure also is something that we learn from. We tried to do something called bond book, because we were very concerned about lack of liquidity in the high-yield bond market, which is the junk bond market, where there's poor liquidity, there were small size of issues, and it was expensive. And transparency would have dramatically changed the economics of the market. And in this particular case, we couldn't get a coalition of the buy-side firms to agree that that was the right thing to do. And to this day, I still don't know why. So the investment banks were able to protect their interests, which they did. Someone sat and told me, I've been doing this longer and before you were in short pants, is what he actually said to me. It's not going to change on my watch. You know, he's passed away now, and it still hasn't changed. So, you know, it's kind of interesting that the economic interest is very strong. You know, a parallel in the marketplace that I'm now involved in would be something like new market tax credits, where, for those of you who may or may not know, is a program that's run by the Treasury called the CDFI, the Community Development Finance Institution. Fund, sorry, CDFI fund. And in their particular case, you know, they issue tax credits. The people who are responsible for administering them are community development enterprises, in effect CDFIs. That marketplace, the commissions, the fees that are paid represent 10% of the amount of principal that's effectively issued. And one of the reasons for that is because there's no transparency to the market space. Contrast it to low-income housing tax credits, which has been around for 10 years longer, which was the same in the beginning, and now is a very cost-efficient market and something that works reasonably well. So transparency, data is extremely important. Bloomberg. I mean, everyone knows about Bloomberg, and I'm not talking about the mayor, I'm talking about his company. You know, one of the things that he recognized is that good, clean data, consistency, and the integrity of that information instills confidence in investors. And that is something which, to this day, is a very strong tool and bunch of information that's available in the investment world. Indices. Morgan Stanley Capital International Index and the FT World Indices. They created benchmarks. They came from data. They came from enterprise data that came up to big data that allowed investors to be measured in terms, fund managers to be measured in terms of their performance. And you know, effectively, whilst yes, Dana, you're right, it's not impact from the way that we're talking about impact and that I now understand impact, but performance at the end of the day is impact from their perspective. In terms of us, data and analytics are fundamental to everything we do, and it's been a nightmare trying to get it, particularly at a market level. It's been very, very difficult. And because we can't get it, it's difficult to unlock the sources of capital that would allow us to fund some of these small enterprises and nonprofits, that would allow them to grow in a different way than they've had before. And part of that is because, you know, it's simply not being collected, or it's being self-reported. You know, many of the things that we heard yesterday. With our clients, we're always trying to find data that can help them to understand. Because if you're an ornery owner or entrepreneur of a business, sometimes you're going to resist this is what you need to do because it shows that you're not actually getting sales around the particular branch office that you've got. So to be able to show them a heat map that shows the number of houses and what their market share is in that sort of area can sometimes change their perception and move them to action, which can lead to a better business. Pricing, you know, hiring, managing seasonality. If they don't have information, they don't have data, it's very, very difficult to do. Internally for us, you know, we use it for pipeline relationship management, client impact assessment. You know, we initially overly customized. I mean, I think keeping it simple is really, really important. We simplified it, and it meant that adoption, because, you know, getting our own internal people to adopt, you can't just mandate it, went from 60% to 95%, and it helps us as well, I think, with risk management. Externally, it's important because you know, we need to be able to demonstrate our own impact. And for me, what we do now is really, really simplistic. And part of the reason is because it's very, very difficult to collect the data and the information and to have a framework that's consistent across other players like us. Now, I can tell you that we created 8% job growth in the businesses that we worked with in 2011, 2012. I can tell you that that was 984 jobs that were either created or retained. I can tell you that there was 14% revenue growth in the businesses that we worked with. I can tell you that the combined revenue was $606 million in 2012, and I can tell you that we supported businesses that represented 4,365 jobs. But I can't tell you much more than that. And more importantly, I can't tell you that every single month. And that's a problem, because I know that people like Heron and others are going to want to drill on those sorts of numbers. And I want to drill on those numbers because I want to know, to Mauricio's point yesterday, that what we're doing is actually having an impact and making a difference. And we can measure that at multiple levels. If we have a company who grows their revenue who's in the inner city, we do have one. A company called Roxby Technology, which is run by an African-American woman that remanufactures toner cartridges. In the time that she's been a client of ours, she's gone from 4 or 5 million of revenues to 19 or 20 million, from 18 or 19 employees to 64 employees. 16 of them have criminal records. That's a big deal. 70% of them walk to work from the neighborhoods. Right? I would like to be able to do that for every single entity that we work with, that level of granularity. And it's very difficult to do because we have to figure out how to actually incent those entities to report that information to us. I would say, just finally, that I think that for the social sector, I see some entities that are actually investing a lot in the nonprofits, in the what I think of as management information systems, data, measuring what they do. But they tend to be the organizations with quite a lot of revenue. So maybe I can think of one that's $115 million now. And they can demonstrate the impact that they're having within the school system. I think it helps to create more efficiency. I think tracking and measuring impact is important and leads to, at the end of the day, better decision making, and allows the organization itself to focus on what really matters, so you don't get lost in the noise. And just as a final thought, I wonder whether there's not a role that the community foundations can actually play in this regard. So if you look at someone like the Boston Foundation, they fund a number of annual data gathering exercises that actually are important to the city and the community, that are sort of the beginning of something that could become more of a bigger type of movement.
Great, thank you. Richard?
What was the question again? Sorry.
So,
I'm the second string replacement. So
translate.
Last night I was speaking.
So you've been, and you hinted at this in your opening remarks. You have a view of the for-profit space, and then you entered the nonprofit space. What's your diagnosis of the nonprofit space and why we aren't moving faster?
Well, I guess my perspective is more from a part of the country where speed is everything. So it's probably even more accentuated in terms of the difference. But so what I like about being from Silicon Valley is everybody tries to disrupt some existing enterprise of some sort, right? And that engenders both the innovation part of it, as well as it actually causes the large organizations to be much more responsive and ultimately much more competitive. And these upstarts are relentless, and they get funded, readily, easily, and so it attracts a lot of very talented people to go in and tackle these things, right? And even though they're very talented people, they're still like tremendous difficulties in really being successful, right? But people keep trying it and trying and trying it. I think in the nonprofit space, you're starting to see some of that, where there are upstarts that are really starting to change the way they do things. And some are controversial. You probably know many of these guys, right? The Kivas and the Charity Waters, and even Change.org. And some of them are my friends who've started these things, right? But what they're trying to do is change the way that these nonprofits go about being successful, and not just doing the same old thing over and over again. And of course, there's going to be a lot of failures, because that's what happens with startups. And so I think this is we're at a great moment in time where I think it's much easier to start to, even in this sector, start to do some of these things, right? Even on the side of, so earlier I talked about how you can acquire more donors and volunteers and things like that. I think there's tremendous opportunity in really trying to outreach and help the beneficiaries of this aid be much more effective, right? So when Murthy was talking about his lending thing, I thought, wow, some of the things you can do is, with the ubiquity of mobile smartphones, and it is going to be everywhere. It's already, I think, like 70% penetration in the US, you can create simple little, Foursquare-like check-in things so that, hey, if you actually made your payment on time for that loan, for example, or mortgage, you can check in that you did it, right? And then you can actually automate a lot of the feedback. And you can even have their friends and peers give them a thumbs up if they do, right? And oh, by the way, if they're 7 days late, give them a thumbs down. And that kind of feedback is utilized right now in social gaming. There's all sorts of things that it's incredibly effective at doing, right? And we funded one social gaming company, and so I learned from experience what that peer pressure does, even in a silly thing. So it's a company called Lucky Train, and they did a game called Lucky Train, which is exactly like Farmville. And Farmville has, whatever, 200 million people playing this silly thing, right? And what you do is, in this particular game, you try to build your trains, and you build a little town. And so the more passengers you have on your train, you get more money, fares and all that, and you can build now a bank and schools and all sorts of things, right? But the way you play is, because they're all social games, you have to invite your friends to be passengers on this train. It's the way Farmville works too, right? They have to buy your crops and things like that. And so what you do is, when you're first playing, and the guy who started Farmville's an old friend of mine, Shizao, a really smart guy about using small little progress bars to enact behavior change, right? And using peer pressure to do that as well. And it absolutely works. So what happens is you invite your friends to play this train game. And we were investors, so that's kind of the only reason I was playing the game, right? Just to be clear, just to be very clear. And so you send these off these little trains, you invite your friends, and so now you're on level 3. And so, it takes you 5 minutes to get to level 3. So it makes it really easy to sort of get sucked into this thing, right? And now you want to get on level 10. And they don't show leaders, where it's really hard, the really top players, they just show the levels of your friends. So it's more of a community thing, right? And the problem is, after a couple of weeks, you kind of get bored, you don't really want to play. But what happens is, when you are passengers on your friends' trains, because there's reciprocity, you actually can't get more points until they send their train to you, and you send it back to them, right? And that's the way the game works. They have to send it to each other. And so all of a sudden, you stop playing, and your friends will start pinging you, hey, Richard, can you send your train tomorrow? I really need 50 more points, right, to get to this thing. And they'll send you little messages. And all of a sudden, now you have tremendous guilt to go and keep playing this game. And so I found myself every morning checking in and playing for 3 minutes, sending out a whole bunch of trains that I really couldn't care less about. But those kind of mechanisms are really effective, right? And that's how these games work. And some people now want to get ahead more quickly, and therefore they're willing to, and they always have 2 levels of currency, and that's how they make money. I mean, Zynga, that last year, did $600 million in revenue, right? And this is a 4-year-old company getting people to buy virtual carrot seeds and things like that. And this train game worked the same way. But a lot of it was using peer pressure. So I think a lot of this can be applied even, especially at least in this country, for aid to to these kind of things, right? And it's just clever ways to try to utilize these same mechanisms that have been worked in the commercial world, if you will.
Well, we're going to open it up in a minute for audience questions, but just one last question from me. So, if you were advising a foundation about the critical path to opening up enterprise-level data, what would you advise them to do?
Well, first I would say that they have some enterprise-level data today. And I think somebody said, good and perfect can't be enemies, so we've got to get started. I think the single biggest factor that you look at, it doesn't matter whether you're looking at the performance of a fund or whether you're looking at a performance of a company or you're looking at any organization, it's leadership. We have to have the will. Do we want to solve this problem or not? If we do, there's no technical hurdle. It's a choice. So, yes, there are obstacles. Yes, transparency is critical, ultimately. But I think, I'm pretty simplistic about this. We've got lots of evidence that there's stuff that will work. And I know that there's this sort of allure of sort of getting hooked into thinking, well, if we all speak Greek, we're going to be able to figure it all out. And I think that's a fallacy. Or if we all get in the same system, we're going to be able to figure it out. I also think that that's a trap. We live in a heterogeneous world. We live in a world where people speak lots of languages. You might call something violence prevention. You might call something harm reduction. Okay, I understand the allure of that ontology, but the fact is, you know, and I think you're right that transparency is important, but we cannot let this sort of idea that we've got to build this lexicon before we can start moving. I just reject it. I think we start and we decide. That's the critical thing, that we need to do this. And if we decide that that's what we need to do, then, you know, we instrument ourselves. My feeling is the field at large needs to instrument itself for learning. And that's the decision to make. And then how you do it, it'll be messy. You'll make some bad choices. That's life, you know? Everybody who's gone down the path knows that it's an iterative process.
So I wouldn't actually say anything else that I didn't say before. And I still believe that if you want to unlock the capital, which is actually the issue that I think we're being asked to address, if you don't have standards and you don't have some broad agreement on lexicon, doesn't mean to say everyone has to play in the same space, is not going to happen. But not in terms of the longer term capital. And I believe that the foundations, at least as far as this world is concerned, and if they're trying to move to impact-based investing and mission-based investing, they're going to have to provide some of the leadership to make that happen. And I think it's going to have to be through you know, their own, the hold that they've got over the funding dollars.
Just to sort of draw a circle around that, I think we're actually, I think it's just a question of sort of who does that work. Bloomberg really, if you look at like how that got done, it neither got done by the players in the market. No, you know, if you think about the funder versus the nonprofit, I think the issue is if you try to actually do the connection direct, I don't think that's the path. I think the idea that you have service providers, that's what made it possible, right? And I think that some people get confused by that, and I just wanted to draw that distinction.
I would agree with that. That's why I think actually the
so Bloomberg translated and made sure it was clean.
Got it, but there was a demand for it from both parties.
Absolutely.
Right? And then I would say that CoopMetics could play that role. Certainly as far as the world that I'm in, they could definitely play it, because we can't do it because we're not independent.
Right,
and if you're not seen to be independent, it's very, very difficult to create that information.
And I think that it's important that there's also two distinct pieces of intel that we want. One is around the health of the organization as measured by financial well-being, and the other is related to impact. And these are not the same. And I mean social impact. There are many frail organizations that are actually quite good, and that doesn't mean they're ready for capital either. So there's questions, I understand, but I think we have to realize we want two different flavors of data, and ultimately those need to come together.
Well, I'm not as familiar with the nonprofit world, but at least in the for-profit world, and I've been on quite a number of boards, and it's very goal-driven for startups, right? And they don't have to be profitable. That's usually not a goal for almost any startup I've ever been involved with. But they are very. There is a board, and that board is very aggressive about seeing if the entrepreneurs or the management of that company achieves their goals, right? And I know that's sort of the same ethos or the same sort of culture within nonprofits. It's like, and here the goals are not sell more handbags or whatever it is, right? But it could be help more people in poverty, and how you would describe whatever the lexicon is to describe it. But it is there is usually a very active board of directors who take their responsibilities very seriously about are you making your goal? And every week, every quarter, you can you sometimes get called by your board guys, and sometimes once a week, and I hate that. The entrepreneurs hate that, but it really again, it's that peer pressure, right? And I think if there's more of a culture of that in nonprofits, and there again, the goal, set those goals and make sure that delivery happens. And on the foundation side, it's like, since you're probably usually the board members on these things, provide that sort of guidance, right? And of course, for the for-profit, for these startups, and you're going to die if you don't meet your goals. Even if you just stay, because you need to raise more rounds of funding. It happens every time, right? And so if you start to miss, user acquisition or enterprise sales, depending on what your product is, you will absolutely not be able to raise that next round of funding, and you will be gone. And there's a tremendous amount of pressure on the part of entrepreneurs to be successful because of that, right? And so it's really just goal setting, as in the for-profit world, anyway.
Let's open it up. Yes.
You said something very interesting when you were talking about the toner lady that you work with, and that was, we have to think of ways to compel these people to give us the information. And it strikes me in the for-profit or the for-revenue world in Silicon Valley, you'd never have to compel anybody to give you the information. You'd be like, I'm giving you money, you need to give me back data about your progress. What's the problem? What's the reason that's hard to do in the social sector?
In the social sector, or
Was it you said, I think you said, maybe I misunderstood it, but I think you said it's hard to get them.
In general, it is very hard.
Give you the information.
We can get it from our clients.
Yeah.
Because we have a relationship with them. Right? Then there's the whole confidentiality piece, so you need to then aggregate it up. But I'm actually interested in a much, much bigger universe. So, I want multiple enterprises to be in there, because that then allows you to see, what the histories are, what the trends are likely to be, default rates across, different sorts of businesses, different sizes of businesses, because there's a perception issue, right? So, in the bond markets, you can get any data you want pretty much about a company. You know what the probability of default is, you can do all sorts of analysis. In our world, you can't do that. So what it means is that when I go to see a prospective investor in us or in a fund or something like that, they're going to ask the question of, okay, what's the probability of default? And I'm going to give them a statement. I'm going to make a statement. And that statement is going to be based on something that's really, really imperfect. And they know it, because they're accustomed to doing very, very detailed regression analysis, all sorts of different things. So it's collecting the information, right, in a way that gives integrity to what it is that's being looked at.
It's aggregate information.
Yes.
Across the board that's the problem, not the individual that you're investing.
Yeah. Got it.
I just think it's worthwhile talking for a moment about numbers and comparisons between the for-profit and the nonprofit sector. The vast majority of all enterprise, and particularly for-profit enterprise, is tiny. It's less than 4 FTEs. The revenue size is less than $200,000 a year. That's the majority. So you wouldn't go, Richard, to your local bodega or nice Italian restaurant and say, we want information rights, we want reporting, and we want you guys to be talking about both your social goals and your financial, because you know what? They're not going to go for, they don't care about the capital markets. They kind of have a line of credit maybe from the local bank, and it's the same for nonprofits. They're much more the same, they're much more similar to their counterparts of the same size as an enterprise. So for example, when you're talking about the board of directors, Harvard, let's say, what are they, an $8 billion revenue, expense-based corporation per year. They're not public, they're not at the big public company level, but they're sort of, up there. They're not, multi-trillion. Then you start talking about a different set of board behaviors and so on. So I just think it's very important to keep in perspective the fact that you're comparing public companies or future venture companies to small community-based organizations. It's sort of like comparing. So I think we gotta just try to get the data right from a size perspective and the nature of the beast. And when you're talking, and the organization itself has to actually have an incentive to find this data useful. And what happens typically in foundations is that because the size of a grant that goes from a foundation is tiny from an enterprise point of view, they pick tiny enterprises to have a, quote, impact on. Because they won't have an impact on you if they're making an average grant size of $50,000 a year. they're not going to have impact on anything much beyond $300,000 of expense base. So there's all sorts of things that are about the numbers. They're not really about, oh, these, benighted nonprofits don't really want, they have no incentive, actually. So I just think it's important to understand the nature of the kind of, not just the capital market, that's sort of, that's the advanced class. Reliable revenue. Most nonprofits' reliable revenue is from earned revenue, 70%. So, there's differences in these markets, and there's size differences that I think we have to be cognizant of if we're going to start talking about data, information rights, et cetera, et cetera. Just, I think it's important.
We'll go here and then close. Just to build off what Clara said briefly, I mean, there's also a structural issue. The idea that the funders could just say, give me the data, it sounds good theoretically, but there's a structural problem in how most philanthropic funders fund. Just as Claire was saying, most philanthropic funders give small grants for programs. So they do say, give me the data on that program for last year. So the nonprofit collects the data on that program for last year and gives it to the fund. It might be real, might be not, might be validated, might be not. And that doesn't give them enterprise level data. It doesn't give them enterprise level data. It doesn't give the funder enterprise level data. It doesn't give the sector enterprise level data. And so because there isn't capacity core funding for multi-year at a size that allows for that, give me that kind of data, the idea that the funders demanding it would change it sounds good in theory, but ultimately it has to be about the leadership wanting to collect the data for their mission and believing that it will make them achieve their mission. That's where it ultimately has to live. And the ways that funders could incent that or support that are important to look at, but it's not going to be the ultimate key to solving it.
But I think that if you were prepared to actually have that as a core part of your funding yourselves, that might actually change it. And I would argue that, at least in the nonprofits that we work with, the vast majority of funding is not for any form of infrastructure, whether it's the technology underpin, the gathering of information, the management structure. It's most foundations say, no, we don't fund that. We'll fund a program, we won't fund it.
Or one question would be maybe if there's a opportunity there then, right, for a company to go and provide, a very, very simple automation, because there's a lot of long tail stuff that happens, even for, these kind of, accounting things. I mean, a good example, Marissa was using Mint, right? I mean, it's for individuals, but there are several startups that are essentially creating Mint for small businesses. And we're talking about Mint for like flower shops and things like that, which is, 4 people and maybe has, 2 part-time employees. And of course, they have to be, they usually, the owners of these things are fairly diligent about tracking their profits because that's how they make a living, right? They can't even eat dinner. And so they are incented in that way. But they obviously can't go hire, understand how to, save their money, not invest in capital markets that, maintain their cash flow and all that kind of stuff, right? But there are actually services and startups that are providing products that make it incredibly easy to track the budgeting of that stuff. So is there maybe an opportunity for a company that does it primarily for the nonprofit world where you can set up some additional sort of metrics that a program that you would fund, and obviously I know it's more complex because there's many different types of programs, and they affect, some are climate change versus some are for poverty and education and whatever it is, right? But there's probably at some level some way to distill it down to certain things that where the reporting is literally pushing some buttons, which is why Mint was so successful, getting college kids to do budgeting, right? Which is not something anybody really wants to do, but they do it because it's actually giving interesting feedback to them as well about where you spend your money, right? And so there might be an opportunity to really create something like that. And I think at that point, that adoption might have to be driven by the foundations because they still, there still needs to be an incentive involved, right?
It strikes me there's another structural issue, and or it's multifaceted and it's kind of a corollary to what Victoria is talking about. That the foundations ultimately don't report to anybody. So the institutional investor, the Gates Foundation actually is a bit of an exception because the money cares. The money is there's a shareholder of the Gates Foundation, and the staff, kind of reports in a real way to a shareholder there. That's very unusual in foundations. And there really is, and the giving patterns are typically short-term, 3 years maybe. And so there's neither, the institutional investor is then really not invested in a way. The program officers are not rewarded by the quality of their grant making. The foundations who request information are not necessarily requesting the same information that other foundations are requesting. The grantees are not sure what really matters to foundations and really doubt whether anybody's reading the reports that they submit. Anyway, there's no dynamic that reinforces the value of reporting internally other than a board of directors of an organization. The quality of the boards of directors of organizations are hugely variant and seldom incisive, I'd say. So there are no dynamics that really reinforce that are gonna require the extraction of something consistent until we get into systems like CoopMetics, and until we're able to combine social indicator or social impact data along with financial impact data in that kind of system. But otherwise, and that's reinforced by a large number of influential funders and program officers who are then rewarded on the basis of how well they do. It's kind of, we require almost a bifurcation in foundations of the money side and the program side. And I'd like to see more intermediary grant making so that the Gates money doesn't have to go through the Gates program staff, for example, because that's an incestuous thing that limits the power of the Gates money. But there are these structural dynamics that are really in the way.
And maybe, Buzz, that it's a dream, but maybe if the corporates are forced to have the social element as part of how they're measured, that will force the pace to change and have more funding coming in to build the different sorts of intermediaries. I mean, it's a dream, but...
I would just say to Buzz that I was at the Pew Trust and did a lot of grants, and Pew does a lot of grants. We had a $4.5 billion endowment, and we didn't need any measures because every grant we made was terrific.
Of course.
Seriously, we never made a mistake. I mean, I want to ask you all, everybody here, because I'm listening to Clara, and if she says the word enterprise one more time, I just don't know what I'm going to do. Clara is not talking about the nonprofit sector only. She's saying, thinking about all the investees you know, what do we know about their social impact? It's not restricted to nonprofits. Government's in there. And we're trying real hard with performance.gov to get some sort of a handle on how government agencies do. So I was wondering whether you all as a group or individuals had an indicator of any kind, because you talked about bad decisions you made, good decisions you made, something that you saw, one indicator, a bellwether that was either positive or negative, that you wish you had paid a little more attention to and then had drilled a little bit deeper to see whether the other data was any good. Do you know what I mean? It could be like in presidential political science, scientists who study presidency, you know, we talk about bellwether counties, which is kind of unfashionable. But the type of dog the president has is considered a small bellwether of potential warlike activity. Beagles being a terrible warning. That's actually half true.
I have a picture of Bo on my phone, for real. I ran into him on my last day at the White House. It was so awesome.
Great.
I mean, I would have taken a picture. No, I would have taken a picture, you know, with the president in the Oval Office. That would have been cool. But I ran into both.
I mean, we're talking about bellwethers. Is there anything that you would say to somebody looking for bellwethers, positive, negative, that you saw along the way that, oh my God, if I had only looked more closely, that was the tip-off? Or not? I mean, maybe there isn't such a thing.
You mean for the companies we've been involved with, or?
There's organizations that you know well enough. You know, they all have social impact. Anything that might have triggered a deeper look.
So I perceive that we are, there's two pieces of correlate data that are necessary, and what we are focused on primarily first, because we've got a lot of analogs in the for-profit sector, is the financial data. I mean, clearly there are many mechanisms to discern the financial health of an organization, and so that's what people go for. And it's important. And could we get that in a Mint-like, easy, no-friction strategy where, you know, we don't have the negative incentive issues that are present, and that we've got, you know, more of a utility structure for the field? I think that's very doable, and not far off, actually. The harder question that I think you're asking is like, okay, what about real value in terms of to society, right? And we can count really well. We can count how many jobs have been created. We can count duration, so we're good at counting too. I think the question of like things around mental health, you know, or you know, I think about work that I've been involved with foster youth, you know, in terms of, you know, resiliency. How do we measure resiliency? Are they on track? Did they make it through that program for that year and seem to be doing well? But does that longitudinally really work? And I think so much of our research is very narrow that we don't really know. And so the question around like, are there bellwethers? Sure, there are. In different programmatic layers, I think people have teased out different metrics that they think are indicative of success or value creation. But we, I think as a field, do not have an instrumentation for learning, nor do I think we have that in a utility sort of framework today, even, you know, even remotely. I think we're way closer on the financial side, even though I understand my colleagues, you know, sort of adamance that we need to do it. I mean, I just think that that's a layup. I think the challenge is, you know, how do we really extract the rest of the values structure?
So I would say that it's gut feel. When I don't follow my gut feel, I make a mistake. And that may not be a bellwether in the way that you're thinking about it. No, but you're asking that if you don't follow, the qualitative component is really, really important. That's what it comes down to. And, you know, and I look, if someone's not measuring and managing what they're doing and they can't articulate that, that's a problem. And it will become a problem at some point of time. It may take 10 years to manifest itself. But if you're not measuring it, it's really, really hard to know whether it's, you know, right or wrong, or how much more emphasis to put on it, more capital, more people, whatever it happens to be, whether you're a for-profit or a not-for-profit. And plenty of the businesses that we work with don't do that. And, you know, we're trying to get them there so that they understand that the power, the gut feel around, you know, whether 80% of their sales come from 20% of their customers, it's much more powerful to say, well, actually, the real number's this, and here's where the concentration is, and here's how you could expand it. But I do think that intuition is really, really something to pay attention to, the qualitative.
And then sometimes these goals, the goal setting, you can use, you know, proxies of other things, because especially in startup companies, you don't really have much revenue to go by, right? Because you're still building a product, and you're still trying out different ideas even of what that product might be, right? So what, you know, I've seen actually many different ways to set up these sort of, you know, proxy metrics. So one company, for example, that I was on board of, they set up email addresses that they capture because they were using it to identify people as part of, you know, their database of information on people, right? And so every board meeting every month they would report us how many emails. Another one was how many page views through cookie drops that they did on partner sites, right? And again, this is a way where it was difficult to, at that point, they didn't know how that really translated into revenues because they weren't sure what they would capture from each one of these things. But they knew they wanted to sustain some level of growth. They set up some goals to inform the board, hey, in the next year we're going to get from this many page views and this many cookies dropped to this many, right? And then what they then were able to do is get that entire organization focused on we got to achieve that metric. And that metric was primarily a proxy, ultimately, to get more customers and get make more money for whatever they were selling, right? But it's the ability to do that was helpful to focus people, right?
I want to get the panel's opinion on kind of where the biggest gap or biggest opportunity you saw in the nonprofit information ecosystem. Some of the different things that people have talked about is obviously information gathering, information creation, and then information aggregation, collecting that across various NPOs and putting it into one place. And then there's information distribution, getting that information that's either aggregated or from the individual parts to end users. And as Buzz was talking about, it's, well, what do the end users do with it? What analytical tools do they have? What's the process that they look at this data? What actionable items they take? What further steps outside of the board or whoever else is evaluating the data? How they use that data? And then to, I think, Clara's point, framing question is, if you have an information framework and a mechanism, then who do you apply this to? Is it every organization in the country or the world, whether it's for profit or not for profit, across those different kind of steps in the circle, where do you think, from your viewpoint, obviously, where the best gains are to be made, given the different states of development, relative development everywhere?
From my point of view, it's not about the nonprofits, actually, because I agree with Clara on that one. The single biggest problem is getting the data at what Liz calls the smaller level, and then figuring out how that aggregates up and making sure there's integrity in it. I mean, for our business, I would never believe Dun & Bradstreet or Hoover, which is what Kaufman says is the gold standard. I'm kind of thinking, really? Doesn't do what I need to do. But so, and I think that's probably the same for everybody. I may be wrong.
In my limited experience on the nonprofit side, although sitting on 4 boards over the course of 20 years, I think they didn't have enterprise data like we think about it in the business context. So simple, business intelligence sort of their own organization. And what they had is many siloed systems, whether it's a relationship management system, an accounting system, a donor management. There's lots of sort of systems. They weren't really bridged together. And I think the opportunity that my colleagues mentioned around leveraging the potential for impact, they were just absolutely not clear who their champions were in the space. And so there was great opportunity there, and we were probably leaving lots of potential on the table. On the foundation side, what I've seen is that the same is true. There's lots of sort of siloed information, whether it's finance or grants management, or even Outlook is an information set, because there's all the social paradigms of what's in Outlook is actually your network. It's the network of the organization. And they're not brought together yet. So I think there's to the question of ecosystem, I think there's sort of simple, pretty tried and true business intelligence strategies that to me feel like sort of step one. Sort of most of these people have systems. Connecting those systems together to have sort of a more holistic understanding of the organism, the enterprise, is doable, and it's doable without a lot of effort, and thanks to lots of great tools that have already been forged in other spaces. And I think that there's a big ecosystem question. I do believe a utility player that can support both sides, the buy and the sell side of this market, I think is really important. And I don't think that, to the point that Victoria was making about, I mean, I know on both sides of it, if we make a $25,000 grant to an organization and then they have to do some special reporting to us, we have just spent our $25,000 on us. I mean, this is the story, so we cannot do that. And I literally was on an organization that granted the money and another where they received it. And I was like, we should just reject this money. This is not a good thing. It was yeah, right? So, sorry.
It's a comment and a question, right? A comment about the indicators that you just mentioned. I think that for any project or any NGO that is there, we could come up with 10 indicators or 20 indicators that would tell us the health of that organization or the health of that project, or even better, the learnings that we can get out of one guy working on malaria for 3 years in some place, right? So I think indicators, I don't think it should be a big issue. It could be solved, I think. Again, I'm maybe naively thinking about this sector. The other thing, we mentioned resources, and you mentioned that again. I don't think that's an issue either, right? We may not focus on the organizations where we give 25K, but let's think about those where we give $1 million up at least, right? Or 200,000. I think that there are technologies, as Richard said, that can get these to a very, very low cost. Now, the question I have is, assuming that there's no friction in finding the indicators or the money, do these NGOs or non-for-profits or projects really want to share all this data, yes or no?
In my experience, and again, I think there's lots of other people in the room who can say it and who have a lot more experience, is to a degree. Some data, yes. I think that there's sort of a false sense of partnership in this space, and my perspective is the grantee and the grantor don't always have a joint partnership. Like in the venture community, you plunk your money down and you're going to try and make sure that that organization is successful. Here, it's like, okay, I'm going to put my money down, and you're going to we're going to just see, you know, if you do okay, but not necessarily intervene, because there's that perspective of not, you know, intruding or not pushing your power dynamic on that person. So it's not an authentic partnership always. Not always. Sometimes it is, but often it's not. And so I think that if you're really in a partnership with somebody, you're more likely to really open the kimono and really be present and say what's not working. But if you're worried you're going to cut off your funding by being too open, then yes, people will be. So I think trust and sort of creating that partnership is actually quite important.
If I asked Richard, probably 10 years ago when you were with your company, right? Give me the secret sauce of your algorithm to get the ads. Of course he would not give that away, right? Because that was your power. That was what made you unique, I guess. When I think about the NGO world, and you think about a project working on malaria for 3 years, that's a person trying to solve a big problem, and hopefully trying to build knowledge that others will be able to use afterwards. So I would never ask that to the private sector, to Richard, or to a private company. But in the NGO world, where there's problems that need to be solved, and knowledge that has to be built, and data that has to be generated that is usable, that's where I would think that this data has to be really, really open. And I'm not so sure, for what I've been talking these couple of days, that NGOs are really interested. I don't think it's about the indicators or the money. I think it's, do they really want to share all that knowledge with the world?
Well, it's just stepping out of my facilitator's role for a second. Well, I think because somebody's in the for-profit sector or nonprofit sector, they're still a human being, and they still have incentives, or they still. So if you're in the nonprofit world, it doesn't mean you're not competing. You are competing fiercely for money, and the way you get money is you get profile and you get attention. So his secret sauce is just as important as somebody in the nonprofit world who's coming up with some breakthrough, because they're trying to raise their resources, and the way they raise the resources is they raise their profile. So they want the spotlight. So that dynamic is absolutely active.
Between sharing information with your, let's say, your venture capitalist funders. You're willing to share with them. They've given you money. You trust them. And sharing the information with the world, or they say this is how it's going to be. You're giving it this data, and you're willing to do it. And I think it's important to draw that distinction between willing to share up, and it seems like we haven't talked much at this event about how do we deal with the confidentiality of this data and sort of the ethics of at what point is it okay for it to go out to the rest of the world or to other people, or how do we deal with those issues? I think that's an important area for us to think about.
And rest assured, that's the next panel.
Although I've seen some organizations start to be very forthcoming and do a great job of providing like Kiva is a good example. I don't know if you've seen their annual report. It's tremendously detailed. They do really good infographics on the success of their programs, right? And because of that, I think they are very successful at fundraising. They seem to be very successful at getting even a donor base that's well outside of just the traditional foundations. But they are very, very they create a lot of importance around that transparency of the effectiveness of their where their dollars go, their lendings and all that kind of stuff.
I think that there's a difference between that's not understood among most funders and in the nonprofit world as far as financial role is concerned. So some of the people who provide funds to nonprofits are buying their services on behalf of third parties or just directly. And some of them are capital investors. In the for-profit world, these roles are very clear. They're muddled and they're poorly understood. So from the point of view of information rights, buyers don't have the information rights that capital investors have. And I think that that's a perfectly reasonable way to look at the nonprofit world too, that kind of enterprise finance. And I think the Kiva example, while wonderful, is not information. It's public relations, and it's terrific. But it's not transparency. And that's reasonable. There's no, that's what for-profits would do the same thing. They want to get donors. They want to drive traffic to the website. That's what that's for. That's not actually reporting.
But sometimes people have the data, and they're not organized in a way that they want to share it, right? So I'll give you a specific example. Initiative for Competitive Inner City, a small organization, 3.5 to 4 million. They have 15 years of history, of information about inner city 100 winners every single year for those 15 years. They didn't think and say we should go back to them every year and collect the data. Can you imagine that if they'd done that, they would have a data set that could prove a lot of different things. And while it wouldn't be huge, it would be robust enough that people would look at it and say, wow. Or they have something called the State of the Inner City Economy, right? And they could create indices of the top 100 cities.
I'm with you.
And they're not doing it.
And if they had been reporting it to a database like CoopMetics, where they could get comparables of similar organizations and be in a market and kind of learn from each other, then it would have been even better.
I just wanted to make the point. I think one of the major distinctions between mission-related investing and for-profit investing is that the impact investments sort of measure their impact, and even though it's not universal and we don't all have the same standards and there's no continuum like there's for risk, there is within each organization a discrete set of objectives that they're trying to hit. What's distinctive about impact investing versus others is that having invested many times in for-profit companies, at the end of the day, that when they fail, you have a lease you don't want and some office furniture. When an impact investment fails and you lose your money, you can still point to some incredible progress, and that's what I think is a huge distinction. So if you're looking at digital, I'm thinking of some that are for-profit or non-profit, but let's just say you're training kids from slums, and those kids are getting jobs and moving on and starting their own enterprises. You do that for 5 years. The impact is tremendous, generationally tremendous. Then the organization shuts down. You have a lot to show for the investment, quite a lot. And that's true in many areas, and it's something to think about when you make an investment, because I think pointing to those impact indicators that you're measuring, acres under sustainable management, children who didn't starve that year, et cetera, et cetera. So all those things are progress, and they're valuable, and it's something that people ought to be talking about, and they don't. They say this one didn't work. They did microinsurance and it failed. Well, it might have failed as a business model, but I look at those kinds of investments, and particularly in nonprofit, but also in the for-profit world, as R&D for commercial markets. And it's worth thinking about that as what they failed, and all the people who picked up in their place and learned from what they failed and kept going. So.
I may be being slow today because I had too many wines last night, but I'm confused at the differences between the Silicon Valley model and why you can't apply that model, particularly to the point you were talking about where these are small companies. Because it seems that in Silicon Valley you have a lot of people that are 3-person companies coming to the market looking for money to grow those companies. And then in the social sector you have small companies that likewise, the best of them, the ones that are ambitious, that have the ability to produce more jobs and really have a bigger impact on poverty, are the ones you want to single out to say those are the ones that are going to have the biggest impact. And against those people, again, they have clear goals, right? If their goal is to generate, 30 jobs this year, just like in Silicon Valley with the board, you'd sit there as the board and you say, did you create 30 jobs or not? Those are your goals. You'd have micro indicators, right? Here are all the steps you were going to take to create those 30 jobs. And I'd be able to evaluate that investment and say, how are they doing? And it seems that there's all sorts of things you can steal from Silicon Valley, because Silicon Valley works quite well in terms of incenting people through peer pressure, through board oversight, to grow quickly and be successful, that might be useful to port across, even if it's not the norm in the category at the moment of social. And so perhaps you could just talk to why it's not a model that, can be overlaid.
I also suggest that maybe taking some people from the nonprofit sector, putting on the board of Goldman Sachs would probably be helpful to Goldman Sachs because they would learn something like a little bit of, moral, yes, or not even humility, just, understanding that they are members of society. So I think that there's some good business practices that can be applied in the not-for-profit space, absolutely, and vice versa. Mm-hmm. But I also think that in Silicon Valley, how many organizations seek funding from these venture capitaloids and don't make it? And how many of these venture firms succeed or fail? And they need two things that most nonprofits don't have just by nature of their commercial proposition. One thing is high profitability, or at least the promise of eventual profitability. And the second is focus on a single overriding goal. Most nonprofits don't have the first and never will. Harvard is a scaled nonprofit, it's 300 years old, and it'll tell you that when it charges $100,000 tuition every year, it actually costs them $300,000. And what do they do about that? They have 2 scaled subsidy businesses alongside their other stuff, and then Harvard Corporation, and the subsidy businesses are investment management and doing basic research in science for the government or whatever it is, patents, etc. They're a complex corporation. So, and they're not profitable. Right. So the nature of the beast.
Their goal is not profit.
No, their goal is not for profit. Their goal is to fulfill a market flaw, to do something that for some reason the for-profit economy can't or won't do. Right. It might be, provide services to people who can't pay for them. That's one of them. It might be do things for which, in the case of Harvard, scale is not going to actually make them more profitable. Like, for example, let's scale a string quartet by taking 2 people only and having them each play 2 instruments instead of 1. And then there are organizations in the nonprofit sector that do things for which there is absolutely no imagined profitability in the future, like basic research in science. That nobody, there are things that they're doing. And then there's finally the things where scale is never, the kind of scale because of technology that increases profitability, some of which is applicable in the nonprofit sector. Some of it is, do you really want to have, fewer nurses in the intensive care unit when you're in there? I don't.
No, I think I'm
so
not
there's
sure
there's certain things about certain business models that don't scale in Silicon Valley, and they're not going to take them on.
I understand.
And
I
so-
mean, I don't think my point was clear, because my point was just, goals, whatever the goals are, they don't have to be profit goals, but take the goals. The way Silicon Valley works is they say, what are your goals as an organization, and then measure against that, right?
The goals aren't so simple as making a lot of money. I'm not saying that those kinds of business, kind of processes aren't useful. They are, absolutely. And there's some things that I think, nonprofit organizations have some of the most resourceful and successful managers in the world. And I'd put them right now, I'd say, the idea of move over honey, we're going to drive has not worked. There has been venture philanthropy for a long time now in the nonprofit sector, some of which has had a positive effect, but it is not by any means a big, it's not like, why can't these people learn to have goals like the rest of us and just scale? And, you really have to understand the business side of it. And when you do, a lot of it won't be so simple.
Yeah. All right, I'll try and learn more. I'm not getting it, but I'll try.
This is great to have a heated discussion. But I think one thing that people maybe don't understand necessarily, so as Claire was saying, in Silicon Valley, you're discarding as you go along because you're looking for the optimized opportunity. And the nonprofit sector is kind of picking up what you've discarded and trying to do something with it. So that adds a level of complexity.
But in an impact situation, aren't you trying to pick the ones that will have the biggest impact? Isn't it the same thing? You're trying to
No,
you're discarding.
it's not. I mean, I would say it's not the same thing because.
Profitability is very simple to measure.
But as Richard was saying, in Silicon Valley, sometimes you use proxy goals for, or in any startup environment, you use proxy goals for profitability. Often, number of users, number of whatever. But the thing is, when you're starting a business, you want the businesses that get favored by investors are the businesses that can easily articulate the proxy goals. And if we look at the nonprofit world, there are certain verticals of nonprofits that will be much easier for them to articulate proxy goals than others. And I think you were touching on this with things like foster care, all different kinds of different systems. So going towards something that sort of adopted, at least on my coast, we need to actually have venture investors favor things that can have proxy goals, which favors certain types of businesses, certain verticals of businesses, things like that. And I think the same thing would happen if the nonprofit sector picked up something like that.
Did anyone ever watch Ali G? Remember the Ali G show? So there's one of my favorite episodes, and if you haven't seen it, it's worth Googling, is he goes into a venture capital firm, and at one point he walks in with the top of a skateboard, and he said, I'd like to raise money. I have a great idea. I'm going to, did you see Back to the Future? You know how they fly around on the skateboards? And they said, yeah. He's like, well, he puts the top of the skateboard down. He said, I'd like to do that. And they said, well, that's the top of the skateboard. And he's like, that's where your money comes in. And that's what impact investing is to me, because I think of that all the time, and I think we're trying to get skateboards to fly, right? We're saying, we want to solve poverty. We're talking about an issue that seems obvious to everyone. We should be flying around on skateboards, but it's incredibly difficult to get there. And if I went to you, Richard, and said, I want to stop people from killing themselves with kerosene fires and breathing bad oils and using them in small spaces, everyone understands that. I'm going to put solar panels on every home in these poor villages in this country. It's going to cost $400 to put one on each home. These people make $2 a day. They'll pay me back in 4 years. And when I hit 75,000 people, I'll break even. That is not a venture capital goes, oh, awesome, where do I sign up? Plus, I'll be back to you in 12 months for more money. I'll be back in 6 months after that. I will put in endless amounts of money. But at scale, it works. That's why it's hard. That's exactly why. Because you're saying, I'm selling something to people who don't have any money. So that doesn't sound good, right? You're often saying, who's your target audience and what are their disposable income? And that's how venture is funded. The only comparable in the venture market that I remember is, you know, the late 90s, where everybody's pouring money into internet companies, and it's eyeballs, right? We're amassing eyeballs. There was a very intangible concept when there was no real internet, when there weren't aggregated giant sites. You know, I remember meeting Jeff Bezos in '96, being like, why did you give up your job on Wall Street? That is the stupidest thing I ever heard of. And then you're thinking, you know, and 6 years of investment, right, before $1 came back. It's the only comparable thing. You're amassing a population that wasn't amassed yet. And that's what you're talking about when you're trying to solve issues around poverty and inequality in society. You're amassing a population that is disparate, that's very hard to find. There is no sales channel. There is no way to reach them. That's what's so expensive. And there's often now a CapEx hurdle. I mean, I think the best advantage we have is mobile phones, because they are prevalent. But again, you can't find those people. You can't sell to them. You can't contact them on their phone. They're all prepaid cards. It's very hard to go door to door in these places, convince them of what they need, sell them something. It's a huge investment cycle first.
Okay, so we have to try. Okay, so we'll go here, and then we'll go back there, and then we'll wrap up.
Well, I mean, I hate to throw cold water on some of this, but well, the dilemma is that the conversations generally in these things always end up in terms of how we fund nonprofits and the organizations and those particular types of organizations. And I keep wondering why, and it's probably because we're used to those kind of structures. They have board of directors or something. I don't know why. Anyway, we keep talking about that, and in the life I've seen and the lives I've seen, nonprofits play maybe a 10% role in people's lives. I mean, probably less than that. You know, a nonprofit will impact 1 of 1,000 people that may need that service, or, you know, it impacts significantly maybe one person's life in many of the others that it's significant. So, you know, a nonprofit is kind of like, it provides a service, sort of like my kids would go to a camp on summer. You know, going to that camp in the summer was a really good thing for my kid. It did not change my life. So, you know, those are not that they're bad things, and there's some good programs, you know, recidivism programs, whatever. So I'm not saying anything terrible to nonprofits, but we're not having the conversation in the right place. You know, I think what's comparable to Richard is this woman, Jolly, who just started a business. Now she's doing a nursing business, you know, in the middle of the night for mothers that, you know, because the nurses are gone and whatever. Then the Fernando, you know, I showed you that these families actually had accumulated $750,000. They're trying businesses. They're not sexy. Okay, they don't have these great ideas. It's like delivery trucks for a bakery, but they bought 3 trucks. They need investment. Okay, so they're not sexy, but, you know, we're still talking really of top down. Even if you go to the nonprofits, you're still top down. What we need to do is get from bottom up. And maybe they're not sexy, and what we don't have are the angel investors, you know, that you would talk to. The comparable to Richard and the startups are these families that we're seeing and the data that you saw. You want to get bottom up, you have to invest in there. And we need intermediary type of organizations that actually know how to invest in that. Not service providers, not the top-down piece. So that's where the system has to really change, because the activity is really at the bottom. These families are amazing in terms of all the ideas and all of the things they can do. We need to capture that information. Otherwise, you don't have a conversation, because you don't have that information. So you keep having conversation about the nonprofits. So somehow or other, you got to help me change this conversation, okay? And we got to get that information out. That's it.
I want to politely but strongly disagree with some of the comments that were made about Kiva earlier. I actually think they're a paragon of excellence for open data, and they publish every single loan that they make in real time, as well as provide an ability through every single open data format that's used today to access that information. In theory, it's a net negative to them. What they have to pay for someone to pull gigs of data and to maintain all those interfaces actually hurts them from their mission, but the externalities and the value to folks like myself and many of us in the room and a plethora of other organizations that can use that granular data as a valuable signal for all sorts of other things is extraordinarily important. And so overall, if the ecosphere were inspiring more organizations to actually release raw data, I think you'd see a radical improvement and a radical change in outcomes of different sets of data coming together.
Any final comments from I concur with the last comment that was made. I think that the push towards open intel is going to change, you know, a lot of what we know, and I think it's part of the apparatus of what we need to do to instrument ourselves for learning. I'll leave it at that.
Okay, well, that's a wrap. Thank you.